give simple answers.
Dmitry Orlov, привет. Gasparin Orlov. This is Piero San Giorgio. I'm very, very happy to speak to you today. You're in the East Coast today.
Yes, I am.
Your book, Five Stages of Collapse, which is translated in Les cinq stades de l'effondrement, is coming out in France, in French. I think certainly the readers which don't know you would like to know a little bit about yourself. Can you tell us a little bit what's your background? You were born in the Soviet Union, right?
Yes, I was born in the Soviet Union. I grew up there. We left the Soviet Union in the mid 70s as part of a very strange deal between the USSR and the United States. I like to call it the brain for grain deal. It had something to do with the reunification of families under international law, but really it was a way of getting rid of people for the Soviet Union and a way of gaining some educated scientific types for the United States. So we ended up in the United States, and I went through school and university in the United States. I worked in high energy physics, and then I went into internet. And during this time, starting in 1989, I started going back to Russia for periods of time. And I had family there, I had friends there, I did business there for a little while. So I had a really good understanding of the transition that went on as the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia emerged as a country. And so all of my writing was initially inspired by what I saw during this transition period.
Your first book dealt with your experience or your analysis of the collapse of the Soviet Union and showing how the Russian and the former Russian Republic people managed to survive pretty well considering the fall of that empire. And you compared that with the state of Western world, especially the United States, and how and your book showed how unprepared North Americans in general, but Westerners as well, are to that collapse. How did that thought and analysis bring you to write the other book, The Five Stages of Collapse?
Yes, well, the initial inspiration was basically coming back to the United States after an extended visit to Russia, watching the collapse work itself out. This was in the mid 90s, which was a very chaotic period in Russian history. And coming to the United States and having this sudden realization that this is going to happen here too. It's just a question of timing. It might lag by a decade or two, but it's going to happen here too. And then the next realization I had was that the Soviet Union was incredibly well prepared for collapse. It wasn't very well set up for day-to-day living, for existing, but it was very well set up for collapse. And the United States is the exact polar opposite. It is fairly comfortable in terms of day-to-day living while things are operating, but when they stop, it suddenly goes away. But then in the next book, I started looking at, well, how do you look at collapse as a process? How can you separate it into stages, and how do these stages relate to each other? And it's sort of an avalanche model that I came up with. It may not necessarily proceed, the phases may not necessarily proceed one after another. They may overlap, they can be out of order, but these stages they have a psychological reality. And so that is helpful in analyzing the situation.
Now, in your book, The Five Stages of Collapse, you explain these five stages, which go from the probably the more obvious, and you'll tell us where do you think we are in these stages, to the most horrible and probably beyond what is even the normal state of human societies as we evolved. How can you tell us a little bit about these five stages?
Well, at the outset, financial collapse is the most likely trigger for the entire avalanche sequence of stages of collapse, because that is really all based on confidence and belief. modern finance is very much a confidence game. There isn't a giant pot of gold sitting somewhere that has a physical reality and that everybody can point to and say, there's no way to make any more of that, so that's what's valuable. Instead, it's just debt and mountains of debt and debt piled upon debt. So in terms of financial collapse, I think it's already happened. I think that we're quite far beyond financial collapse at this point, but what's happening is a sort of theatrical suspension of disbelief. We're basically told that everything's fine because some people have forged some numbers inside computers to make it look like everything's okay, but it isn't. The economies aren't growing, they're shriveling. People's finances are in complete disarray, being covered over by mountains of debt that is fake debt because it'll never be repaid. So we're way beyond, the onset of financial collapse. And then the final stage of collapse is cultural collapse, where people stop acting like people. They stop corresponding to norms of human society. And some of that has happened too. For instance...
Second. Je suis occupé, je suis au téléphone. Faut me laisser, s'il te plaît. Non, je suis occupé. Tu fermes la porte. Sorry.
No problem. So the final stage of collapse is cultural collapse, where people stop looking like what we expect people to look at and don't act appropriately. For instance, parents stop reading to their children. Instead, they hand them some electronic device for them to amuse themselves with. That's a stage of cultural collapse right there, and you can see that. So that has started as well. And there are places in the world where cultural collapse has more or less run its course, where families have disintegrated, where community has disintegrated. A lot of these places are in the United States.
And you can see them on the Jerry Springer show, if that still exists. Certainly, your perspective, once again, having seen the communist world, which indeed was a managed scarcity economy, planned economy, compared to the supposedly free market, but sort of free market economy of the Western world, where certainly abundance is still reigning. You're very right to point out that we are having a financial collapse. Where I don't know what's your perspective on the political collapse, but it's very interesting that you point out cultural collapse in the West, because obviously the Western point of view is often to see, I don't know, some parts of faraway Africa or Papua New Guinea to consider cultural collapse, but in fact we are already collapsing in all these 5 stages simultaneously. They're not just complete, but so once again, how your comparison? Because like me, you're well traveled. You traveled across the world. I also worked in software, and therefore we both have the perspective of both worlds, and at the same time the depth of analysis that you have, and you show it in your books to project these experiences of what can be seen across the world into the world we live, and so. Is there any way we change this traction? Are we doomed to this collapse, or where can we stop and change it?
Well, people have a limited capacity to change themselves. We're creatures of habit. And even if we can prevail upon ourselves to change our habits and change our course, there's also social inertia, and there are the expectations of the people around us. It's very difficult to engineer social change. It's not something that can happen spontaneously. Convincing people that they need to change, actually appealing to reason, is not even a useful approach in a lot of ways. What you have to do instead is appeal to people's emotions and to their physical habits, and a lot of that has to do with taking them out of their physical environment. And those things are very difficult to engineer.
Now, as collapses happen in society, how fast? I know no one can really answer when it's going to happen, but how fast does one go from one stage to another?
Well, financial collapse can be instantaneous. That can be within one news cycle. Um, it basically at this point can happen at the speed of light. Um, uh, Political collapse can take a really, really long time because political bodies of various kinds have virtually unlimited abilities to live as zombies. They pretend that they're alive even though they're not. They pretend to legislate. They pretend to make decisions, and none of it happens. Usually, it all kind of becomes a ridiculous farce when it turns out that they can't pay the phone bills, or they can't keep the lights on for the cameras. That's the point. It's the electricity that turns off a political system, not anything else. In terms of commercial collapse, things can be rather sudden disruptions that are temporary. A few weeks later, become more or less permanent because supply chains break down, and there's a lag time in the delivery of just-in-time goods. And a disruption can take a really long time to work its way through the system. And as disruptions multiply, sometimes the process becomes irreversible because the financial structures that underpin those supply lines can no longer be restored. Something goes bankrupt, it can't be unbankrupted in any reasonable way. And social and cultural collapse, they eat away slowly. It's like water eating away at rock. People don't even know that it's happening.
Mm. From your experience, from your family and friends and business partners in the Soviet Union going into collapse, how did these 5 stages link together, and where did it stop, and why did it stop where it stopped?
Well, before collapse, the way you can tell that something strange is happening is there's a lot of talk and no action. Nothing useful is happening, but there's an incredible amount of very intense discussion that goes nowhere. That's the pre-collapse condition. And then the post-collapse condition is nobody has any time to talk to anyone. Everybody is just ignoring all of that and concentrating on where they're going to get a thing that will allow them to get the next thing that they need to get the next thing. Everything becomes a logistical nightmare. So you have to get vodka so you can exchange it for gasoline so you can drive to get food, things like that, Things that were simple before collapse suddenly become incredibly intricate and complicated with many moving parts. So that's how society shifts. That's how you can tell that, collapse has happened.
And however, the social collapse didn't happen in the former Soviet Union as it collapsed. What kept it together to the point where today it's back as a significant economic power?
Well, the Soviet collapse was not a full-on collapse. What collapsed was the Soviet Union and the Soviet economy, but Russian society turned out to be extremely resilient in a lot of ways. A lot of that was sort of inadvertent. So the society didn't offer a lot of choices for people, so society was static. People didn't tend to move around a lot, so everybody knew each other. And there wasn't a lot of living space for people. The apartments were small, 3 generations living together in one space often. And as a result of that, you had strong families. They may have hated each other, but they were stuck together, so they made it work somehow. And that provided another layer of resilience. The food system was very poor in the Soviet Union, so people tended to have kitchen gardens and grow quite a bit of their own produce. So when the economy collapsed and food, other than basic starches and things like that, became very hard to get, people just basically started doing what they were doing anyway, more intensely. So all of these things that were suboptimal about the Soviet Union turned out to be optimal in terms of a collapsed state. And that is why Russia was able to muddle through to such a great extent. But the other thing that has to be understood about Russia is that it's an incredibly rich and powerful and diverse country. and it would be the richest, most powerful country in the world if it weren't periodically blown up with wars.
True.
So the last piece of the puzzle in terms of making Russia into, a world power that is stable and the rival of all of Europe is to prevent wars.
Now, to some extent, Europe and certainly United States at least regularly claim to be indeed the most powerful and the most stable societies in the world. Before we go into Europe, what makes the United States so fragile and so risky today?
Well, the United States has been going in a particular direction for a long time now, and the trend is irreversible. Basically, what the United States has been doing is cultivating a colony of powerful parasites that have been eating it out from the inside. So if you compare a normal country to the United States, in a normal country, in a normal economy, the basics, the staples, what you need to survive, such as housing, medical care, education, access to a legal system that can defend your rights, communications, transportation, all of those things are reasonably priced so that people can afford them. Luxuries, such as a wardrobe full of clothing that you might wear once, hundreds of shoes, lots of electronic gadgets that you don't necessarily need, vacations, all of that sort of stuff is priced as luxuries.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at the United States, it's a completely upside down economy. So you pay ridiculous amounts of money for things like internet access, which is mostly very poor quality. You pay for transportation because there's no public transportation, so everybody has to own a car, and there's an entire racket wrapped around with lots of fraud around the car industry, the automotive industry. The medical industry is another area of fraud. Just basically everything that is a necessity. Education is part of that. Everything that people need is priced basically using monopoly pricing because it's been relinquished to some special interest group. But all of the luxuries, everything that people can use to spoil themselves, to rack up credit card debt and things like that, is priced very cheaply, very reasonably. So a system like that can perpetuate itself for a long time, but what it's really eating is basically it's carving up and eating its own buttocks. To give you a very basic metaphor, it's eating its thighs. Eventually, it won't be able to walk.
And in that, you linked very much with the writings of Kunstler, of Michael Greer, and Martinson, and very others that show this convergence, and my books too, at Modesty. But we show this convergence of problems in a more and more finite space and time, with depletion of resources, in a political inability to look at the bigger picture and beyond the elections of the day, and more wild migrations of people who want to come and eat as well, and take whatever spoils there are, if not pure conquest, and yeah, there's no way we can avoid these collapses. What about Europe? You've probably traveled in Europe as well. Well, in Western Europe as well. We right now are in a visible crisis with a disconnect between what people fear and want, and the political class who is in their own. Actually, I believe the European Union looks a lot like the Soviet Union, just with more goods. But where do you see Europe going in the next months or years?
Well, Europe has found itself in a very difficult spot because of high standards. It has created a lifestyle and a system for itself that is very complex and very hard to sustain, and at this point, really unaffordable. the people are used to being taken care of to a standard that they can't pay for and won't be able to pay for. And you can see it particularly on the periphery. So there's no way that Greek manufacturers can manufacture things to German standards. Now, in a sane world, you'd get rid of the German standards. In an insane world, you make the Greeks follow the German standards. And that is not going to go anywhere. So what you see in Europe now is the periphery is atrophying. Mm. And I think that, a lot of the countries that used to be East Bloc countries in Eastern Europe have learned a really hard lesson from European integration. And a lot of people there are looking back on the good old days when they were part of the Soviet Empire.
One last negative question, and then we go on to perhaps more lightning topics. But in your books, you do mention violence mildly. Perhaps your experience in the collapsing Soviet Union, violence was not that big as we've been told in the media in Western Europe. But how do you see violence playing out? Because it is a topic that is ambivalent, and people tend to project, when you talk about violence, they tend to project either their own fears or their own hopes into saying, yes, it was going to be horrible, or no, people will not turn violent. The reality is mixed, depends on the culture. What's your take on the violence within the collapsing of societies?
Well, there are different levels of violence. The way I look at it is that people are violent, and they are violent without getting up from their seat much of their time. We do unspeakable violence sitting in front of a computer most of the time. But people think that nonviolent is some kind of a meaningful label. For instance, you can have a nonviolent demonstration, but a crowd is a weapon. A crowd blocking access to a public building is using the threat of violence to itself. It's like a man holding a gun to his own head. Just because he hasn't pulled the trigger yet doesn't mean that he's not using violence. There are two types of violence. Slavoj Žižek wrote an entire book about it. There's the subjective violence, which is somebody hitting you on the head, and then there's objective violence, which is systemic. It's integrated into a system, and it works using the threat of violence more than violence by itself. So we live in a world where we're continuously threatened with violence, and it controls our behavior. And that is the violence that we should pay attention to, not the sporadic getting hit with a brick on the head, which is, traumatic, but not as dangerous, it turns out, as the everyday violence that limits our behavior and restricts our options within society.
So obviously, having been raised in the Soviet Union, you've learned a little bit of Marxist theory, and probably you being a grown up, you know what part is applicable and what part is smart and what part is nonsense. But certainly, what's your take on indeed how can we learn from these mistakes? And now I'll turn into positive topics in the sense for us individuals. How can we learn from these mistakes and work to handle these collapses? For us, first of all, for us and our families, because that's what I focus my books on, and I'd like to have your take on how we can make it. What's the thing to succeed here?
Well, the way to succeed in collapse is to be very practiced at failure. You have to get rid of things that are workable when you don't have collapse, but stop being workable. So things that don't collapse when everything else collapses are families and family ties, close friends that will stand by you no matter what, things you can do with your own hands, such as grow your own food and fix things instead of buying replacements, things you can manufacture instead of buying, in your own workshop, things like that. If you know how to fix a bicycle, then you don't need gasoline. So when gasoline runs out, you still have transportation. Very simple things like that. Collapse brings on poverty. So you have to practice at being poor. Rich people are really hopeless at being poor. They just don't have the skills. So if you want to survive collapse, you know, pretend that you don't have any money, and live that way, and practice. Being poor takes practice. Associate with people who are disadvantaged now, because then you'll know how to deal with disadvantaged people. And when everybody around you is disadvantaged, it's a very poor time to get the social skills that are required for that sort of interaction. Those are very basic things that people can do. That none of them are attractive. You know, collapse, as I keep pointing out, is a faulty product. It cannot be sold. It's ridiculous to try to advertise it.
But then we don't have much choice.
We have no choice at all.
Now, one of the books that you co-wrote and certainly edited, which I really like as well, is Communities That Abide. That book tells examples and shows some ideas on how we can build communities. Tell us a little bit, how does that fit with the 5 levels of collapse as a way to perhaps not turn it back completely, but certainly to stop the level of collapse somewhere?
Well, I looked at communities that avoided social and cultural collapse, even as everything fell apart all around them repeatedly. And they are not the most attractive role models for us. In fact, you know, enlightened, liberal-minded Europeans tend to kind of go into shock when I point out that this is what it looks like. Look at that. So these are Anabaptist groups, Mennonites, that fled, the wars that followed Reformation and settled in various wild places on the new continent, and are there to this day, thriving, having lots of children, gobbling up farmland. And they're gypsies. That's another example. And they have persisted for a millennium or more, ever since their exodus from India way back when. And I looked at their social structures and their coping mechanisms. They're very similar. So when I realized that, I thought, there's a mechanism here. It's not about the specific culture, it's about cultural mechanisms. So if you can draw parallels between gypsies and very religious Anabaptists, there's something going on here. There's a very strong similarity at a functional level. And then I looked at some other groups, like everyone's favorite group, the Taliban, for instance. They're really Pashtun tribesmen. Yeah. The Taliban they're basically Pashtuns. Pashtuns are one of the largest ethnic groups on the planet. They're also one of the oldest, and they're also completely indestructible. So I looked at why they have been able to stand up to all invaders since Alexander the Great with the same result. And again, I looked at not the specifics of the culture, but the mechanisms within that culture, the things, the rules that they play by. And it's these rules that make them indestructible. And they're very unpleasant from our point of view. The way they behave is absolutely unacceptable from our broad-minded, liberal, democratic European perspective. So that's a commonality that I found. And I wrote a book about it, and people have contributed some chapters to it. So it turned out to be a very interesting text. But in terms of a practical guide, completely useless because people go into shock. Yes. So the next book that I'm working on, I'm the editor, but the author is a New Zealander, Rob O'Grady. That book should be coming out next year, is a completely different approach on the same subject. It's called The Power of 150, and it's all about organizing small groups, Dunbar number-sized groups, which is an approach that should be very pleasing to democratic-minded, liberal, enlightened people.
We'll see if any of those still exist in a few years.
I think there'll still be a few.
A few. Now, French readers will read 5 stages of collapse: French, Quebec, Belgian, Swiss. What would be your message to them? If you speak a bit of French, right?
Ah oui, je parle français.
On aurait pu la faire en français, cette interview. La prochaine.
Well,
The next one.
my French is not that good.
We'll do the next one in French. What could be your message to the French readers?
Probably the same message as to the English readers. I would stress something that I don't stress with the English language readers. You see, the English mindset is such that under no circumstances should you ever, quote unquote, go native. There are the English people, and then there are the locals, and you don't interbreed with them if you can help it at all. And they can be sort of your friends, but they're not English, so they're not really your friends.
Yeah, that's not the French way.
That is not the French way. So the French are, and the entire Francophone world is much more integrated, culturally and racially, and in terms of surviving collapse, we need to get our lessons from people and societies that are less fortunate, because we will be less fortunate. So the less fortunate ones are the ones we learn from. So immigrant groups in our midst and various societies that have been disrupted in the past are our role models for moving forward. And the Francophone world is much closer to that edge than the English, who are very, very standoffish. No, this is us, and those people over there, they're not us at all. So that is something to stress. The French do have the ability to go native that the English speakers almost entirely lack.
Would that mean a complete overhaul by necessity or by force of the local culture?
Not necessarily. Cultures can coexist. They're like codes. Just like I can speak Russian and then I can speak English and then I can speak a bit of French or German. With those languages come certain mindsets, certain rules of behavior, down to how you shake hands and various things like that, how people look at each other. All of those things can coexist. And people who live in very diverse societies do this code switching all the time. So you can have, a person who speaks French the way Académie Française that says that you need to, one moment, and then out on the street sounds like somebody out on the street, and that's typical, and it can go on for a really long time.
That's something very Russian as well.
I'm not sure if it's typically Russian. Russia is a very culturally integrated place. That is the kind of the Soviet legacy. There was one education system; everybody learned the same thing. And now there's a big emphasis on standards. Everybody now is well-spoken and polite, and swearing is illegal. Russia is a very strange place. It can outlaw swearing, and it actually works. So Russia is a very homogenous place, strangely homogenous. I have friends from 11 time zones away from where I was born, and you couldn't tell the difference.
Interesting what empires can do. What's your advice? My books talk about how individuals can prepare, and they lead to communities as well, because I think we all agree that eventually, if you're alone, it's meaningless. You have to be part of a community, and indeed, I agree with what you made. The number is the ideal, and I don't know if you know, but Romans. My wife is an urban planner, and she was telling me that the urban planners of Rome had this theory that no city should be above 30,000 people, because that's the ideal size where you can feed it from one day away, surrounding agricultural lands, but also that's the size beyond which the local state cannot be autonomous anymore. And obviously they didn't follow that because Rome was more of above 1 million people. Now, as individuals, you touch this in 5 stages of collapse. What can we do? I mean, you eventually you mentioned some of that, but in terms of autonomy, where do you see us starting? The garden, the water. You yourself live in a boat, right? You have this boat which you can travel. We hope to have you in Europe with that boat one day. how do you work that autonomy? First of all, mindset. How can you force yourself into that?
Well, the boat is actually what's called a life hack. It's a trick you can use it's a transformative trick. Most people are locked into what I call the iron triangle. They have a house to live in. That house costs them money. Most people can't afford to buy a house, and they aren't allowed to build their own shelter. So they buy it on credit and can only live there while they're paying for it. So really, they're borrowing it from the government in one way or another. And to pay for it, they have to have a job. And so you have the house and the job, but you can't work where you live most of the time. So you need a car too. So that's the iron triangle. You have the house, the car, and the job. And most people just basically move between the house and the job. And to break out of it, you have to get rid of the house.
Yeah, you could add antidepressive drugs to cope with all that.
Well, yes, there are lots of other things that compulsive shopping or other compulsions, because people who are imprisoned in that iron triangle generally aren't happy people, as a rule. They complain constantly. There's a fourth institution called the bar, where they go to complain after work, which is essential for a lot of them. But if you get a boat, right, you can get rid of the house. But then you find out that if you have a job, then you don't have time to go sailing, because sailing is something that doesn't work with set schedules. You sail when the wind blows and when the tide is in the right direction, which doesn't coincide with work schedules. So you have to get rid of the job. And then, of course, you're sailing around and can't put a car on a boat. So you have to get rid of the car. Mm-hmm. So there goes the entire iron triangle. So you have a place to live, you have a place to work, because you can work on the boat as long as you have an internet connection, and you don't need a car because you can sail around. You have transportation. So the boat encapsulates all three and gets rid of all three.
Yeah, it's a good solution.
It's the solution that I found. I hope that other people find other solutions, because not everybody can live on a boat. And it's restricted in some ways.
See, I live in a farm. That's my way to get out of this triangle, is to live in a farm, work my garden every day, and in the winter I write my next book, because I have nothing to do in the winter. And
that's almost perfect.
Yeah,
that's another very good solution.
What? When are we seeing you in France?
I don't know. I don't have any plans at the moment. But I would like to come to France.
We should
I will
organize
probably be spending
something.
a lot more time in Russia, so getting to Paris from St. Petersburg is a lot easier.
Oh yes, we should organize something like that. Mm-hmm. Dmitry, spasibo, thank you very much, and I hope we'll do this again very soon.
Certainly, thank you very much.
You're welcome.